Interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals was not like breeding between horses and donkeys. These two human groups were a single species, not different species in the biological sense. However, these interactions had an unintended fatal consequence for Neanderthals. Human evolution is often told as a triumph story, a steady climb toward intelligence, culture, and technological mastery. But beneath that sweeping narrative lies a harsher biological truth. Evolution does not advance through fairness or equal opportunity. It advances through loss. And nowhere is that loss more visible than in the fate of male lineages. Across deep time, the male side of the family tree has been subjected to a relentless filter, a genetic meat grinder in which danger, competition, and reproductive inequality combine to eliminate most paternal lines. Males in both Neanderthal and Homo sapiens societies lived on the sharper edge of survival. Biology and social roles placed them disproportionately in high-risk situations, hunting large game at close range, engaging in territorial conflicts, confronting predators, exploring new lands. These activities were not occasional events, but recurring features of male life. The fossil record reflects this reality. Neanderthal skeletons in particular show high rates of traumatic injury, broken ribs, fractured skulls, damaged limbs. Their pattern of injuries has often been compared to that of modern rodeo riders, repeated, close-contact encounters with powerful animals. This suggests a physically intense and dangerous lifestyle that would have taken a toll on longevity. If Neanderthal males bore the brunt of these risks, their average lifespan may have been shorter than that of females, reducing the window in which they could reproduce. Add to this the fact that reproduction among males was never evenly distributed. In small Ice Age populations, not every man would have found a mate. Some died young. Some were outcompeted by stronger, more skilled, or more socially connected rivals. Some simply fell outside the preferences operating in their group. The result is a system where many males contribute little or nothing to the next generation, while a minority leave a large genetic footprint. Homo sapiens. Males also faced danger, but differences in social organization may have shifted the balance. Larger networks, broader alliances, and more complex cooperation could have reduced individual risk in hunting and conflict. If sapiens males, on average, survived longer or operated in more coordinated groups, they might have had a reproductive edge over Neanderthal males in shared regions. Even a small difference in survival or social success, multiplied over thousands of years, can dramatically reshape the genetic landscape. The consequences of this dynamic are written in our DNA. The Y chromosome, passed from father to son, shows repeated bottlenecks and lineage extinctions. Whole paternal lines vanish from the record, not because the men were weak or unfit in a general sense, but because the system of life they inhabited was unforgiving. High-risk behavior, violent encounters, and intense competition meant that many males never became ancestors. Females, whose reproductive role is biologically central and less dependent on risky display, formed a more stable genetic backbone. Seen through this lens, evolution resembles less a ladder and more a meat grinder. Males were the variable, the expendable side of the equation, constantly tested against environment, rivals, and chance. Neanderthal males living particularly hazardous lives may have been especially vulnerable to this process. Over time, as populations mixed and environments shifted, their lines were steadily reduced, while others expanded. Humanity emerged not only through innovation and adaptation, but through the quiet, repeated disappearance of countless male lineages, ground away in the machinery of survival and reproduction. However, there is a quieter story of human evolution that rarely makes it into textbooks. It is not the tale of heroic hunters conquering males or dominant war bands sweeping across continents. It is not even, at its core, a story about survival against climate, predators, or famine. It is a story about reproduction, about who was chosen, who was not, and whose genetic lines vanished without a trace. Evolution, when viewed through this lens, looks less like a march of progress and more like a relentless filter, an ancient meat grinder in which most male lineages were discarded while a narrower set passed forward. At the center of that process was not male dominance but female preferences, a fatal attraction for Neanderthal males. The fossil record gives us bones. Genetics gives us ghosts. When we look at the Y chromosome, the genetic line passed from father to son, we do not see a rich, branching forest of equal male ancestors. We see a landscape shaped by repeated collapses, bottlenecks, and lineage die-offs. Over and over again in human history, a small subset of males fathered a disproportionate share of the next generation, while vast numbers left no descendants at all. In contrast, mitochondrial DNA, passed through mothers, shows a broader and more even continuity. This asymmetry is not an accident. It reflects a fundamental biological reality. In our species, as in many others, reproduction has always been more competitive, more uncertain, and more ruthless for males. Now project that pattern back into the deep past, into the world where Neanderthals and Homo sapiens overlapped across the Levant and Eurasia. For tens of thousands of years, these two human forms were not isolated curiosities. They met, they shared landscapes, they likely shared shelters, and at least sometimes they shared mates. The traditional narrative imagines mass replacement, modern humans sweeping in, out-competing, overwhelming, conquering. But what if the decisive force was not primarily male aggression, but female preference? What if Neanderthal extinction, at least in part, was shaped by the same sexual selection dynamics that have repeatedly pruned male lineages throughout our own species? Sexual selection operates differently from natural selection. Natural selection cares about survival to reproductive age. Sexual selection cares about who actually reproduces. A male can survive, hunt well, and endure brutal winters, and still leave no offspring if he is not chosen. Females, who invest more biologically in gestation and child-rearing, are the limiting resource. Their selection, conscious or not, become evolutionary gatekeeping decisions. Over generations, those selections reshape anatomy, behavior, and ultimately species trajectories. When modern humans entered regions occupied by Neanderthals, they did not just bring different stone tools or social networks. They likely brought different signals, different faces, different voices, different patterns of sociality, possibly different levels of symbolic communication and group cohesion. To a Neanderthal female, a Homo sapiens male may have represented not merely an outsider, but a potentially advantageous mate, someone from a different gene pool, someone whose offspring might inherit broader immunity, novel traits, or social connections to larger, more flexible groups. Hybrid vigor is not a modern concept. It is a biological reality that often favors mixing between populations. If Neanderthal females sometimes chose Homo sapiens males, even at modest rates, the long-term consequences could have been profound. Each such union would transfer Neanderthal genes into sapiens populations while simultaneously reducing the reproductive share of Neanderthal males. Over generations, this creates a one-way genetic flow. The Neanderthal population does not simply get replaced, it gets absorbed, but in a biased way. The genetic legacy survives, but the original male lines fade. This pattern mirrors what we see repeatedly within Homo sapiens itself. In many ancient and historical societies, reproductive success among men was highly skewed. A minority of males, those with status, resources, charisma, alliances, or other attractive traits, fathered many children. Others fathered few or none. The genetic record preserves this imbalance. Whole Y chromosome branches vanish. Male ancestry narrows like the neck of a funnel. The majority of men in the past are not our ancestors. They are evolutionary dead ends. We can push this idea further back in time, because the contact between different human forms was not a brief accident at the end of the Ice Age. It was a long, tangled history of overlap, interaction, and gene flow, stretching deep into the Middle Pleistocene. The meeting of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals was not a single dramatic collision around 40 or 50,000 years ago. It was the latest phase of a much older pattern, one that may reach back toward 200,000 years ago or more, when populations we would later label modern and Neanderthal were already part of a broader, interconnected human landscape. Sites like Apidema in Greece, Tabun in the Levant, Krapina in Croatia, and others hint at this complexity. These fossils do not always fit neatly into the boxes of fully Neanderthal or fully sapiens. Some are gracile, where Neanderthals are expected to be robust, or show mixtures of traits that blur the boundary. Rather than seeing these as anomalies, they can be understood as signs of long-term interaction zones, regions where populations met, mixed, separated and met again over tens of thousands of years. In such settings, hybrid individuals, especially females, could have played a disproportionately important role in moving genes between groups. This makes Neanderthal extinction look less like a sudden wipeout and more like a slow diffusion of identity. Neanderthal genes did not vanish. They were diluted, redistributed, and recontextualized inside expanding Sapiens populations. But again, this process need not have been symmetrical. If hybrid and Neanderthal females were more likely to have offspring with Sapiens males than Neanderthal males were to have offspring with Sapiens females, the genetic current would flow mainly one way. Neanderthal male lines would shrink, while Neanderthal-derived genes would persist through maternal pathways and hybrid daughters. Neanderthal males, competing in a landscape where some females preferred or accepted Sapiens partners, would see their share of reproduction decline. The extinction of Neanderthals as a distinct group would thus be driven not only by climate or technology, but by long-term patterns of sexual selection. Evidence suggests that hybrid males are much more likely to be infertile, adding another variable to the meat grinder. This reframes human evolution as a story not of sudden replacement, but of prolonged filtering. The meat grinder was running for far longer than a single migration event. From early encounters in places like Apidema and Tabun to later Upper Paleolithic contact zones, female mate selection may have steadily favored certain combinations, certain signals, certain kinds of males. Over time, that steady bias would prune lineages, amplify others, and gradually transform the human landscape. In this view, Neanderthal extinction is not a mystery of disappearance, but a consequence of integration under unequal reproductive dynamics. Their genes survive, their forms influenced ours, but their independent male lines were caught in the same evolutionary logic that has always governed our species: high variance in male success, strong filtering through female selection, and the quiet erasure of most men from the genetic future. Neanderthal males, already facing small population sizes and harsh environments, would find themselves competing not just with each other, but with an incoming group whose males might offer different signals of fitness, perhaps greater social connectivity, different cognitive displays, or simply the allure of novelty. Males in this framework are not the architects of destiny, but the variable. Males carry more variance in size, in behavior, in risk-taking, in physical traits. Evolution experiments on them. Many fail. A few succeed spectacularly. Females, as the more stable reproductive core, filter those experiments. The result is a system in which males are biologically necessary but individually replaceable. Their genetic lines can vanish in a single generation if they are not chosen. Seen this way, Neanderthal extinction becomes less a story of conquest and more a story of integration without equal representation. Neanderthal DNA persists in modern humans, but Neanderthals as a distinct population disappear. This is exactly what we would expect if Neanderthal females sometimes chose Homo sapiens males, but Neanderthal males had fewer opportunities in return. The outcome would be the gradual erosion of Neanderthal male lines, even as their genetic contribution lived on in hybrid descendants. In the end, the disappearance of Neanderthals may reflect a pattern that is deeply human. When two populations meet, genes mix, but not all lineages are carried forward equally. Males bear the brunt of that inequality. They are the high-risk, high-variance side of the equation. Females, through countless acts of selection, decide which experiments in form and behavior continue. Species change not just because environments shift, but because preferences do. The evolutionary meat grinder is not driven by claws or spears alone. It is driven by sexual selection, repeated, subtle, intimate. And in that arena, the fate of male lineages, whether Neanderthal or modern human, has always hung on the quiet but powerful force of female selection. Thanks for watching.